And then they'll all give some opening remarks and we'll dive in. Jonathan Weiner is a decorated diplomat. He's been the U.S. Special Envoy for Libya and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement, among other positions. He's also a scholar here at the Middle East Institute. Emiliano Alessandri is an analyst of Mediterranean, European, and transatlantic affairs. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund and also a scholar here at the Middle East Institute. Alexis Arief is a specialist in African affairs at the Congressional Research Service, where she covers policy issues relating to North, West, and Central Africa. During her time at CRS, she's also been detailed to policy offices at the State and Defense Departments. I'm Dave Lawler. I'm the world editor at Axios, and I write our World News Roundup twice a week. So I have to sit down and decide what are the 5 or so key issues that people should be paying attention to. And I'm writing more about North Africa lately than I was maybe a year or so ago. You just got a great rundown of the political issues in the region from the last panel, so I won't run through all of those again. We'll be touching on the situation in Libya, what's happening in Algeria, any number of issues. But our challenge on this panel is also to look at the regional dynamics, the prospects for increased cooperation between countries in North Africa, the roles of outside actors in the region, in Europe and in the United States, and what the future might look like in terms of trade, development, and security in the region. So with that, I'll turn over to Jonathan to open the discussion.
One of the very last initiatives I got a chance to participate in a little bit and to witness more was undertaken by then Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken in 2016 when he visited North Africa and reached out to Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. I'm not sure if he talked to Mauritania as well, but certainly those, and he was on a lot about Libya, with the notion that perhaps, just maybe, there could be a regional effort, a regional cooperation effort to focus on areas of common interest, whether it was trade, security, or politics. Algeria had a counterterrorism center. Perhaps they could initiate talks on counterterrorism. Perhaps they could do something after 30 years to make the Maghreb Arab Union into something that had real meaning. Perhaps they could do something after 25 years to make it a little bit easier for people from the largest country in population in the Maghreb region, Algeria, with 42% of the Maghreb's population, to cross over to the second largest Maghreb state, Morocco, with 36%, I think, of the Maghreb's population. And of course, the administration stopped soon thereafter and that initiative ended. But it left me with the question, is there anything that anybody can do to have this region start living up to its potential as a region? No, as a region. And as I look at it, I say to myself, it can't happen without Morocco and Algeria working out some common modus vivendi, some way of recognizing one another. And it always drove me crazy. When I was doing Libya, I'd start scratching my head like this and pulling out the limited number of hairs left. Because when Algerians tried to do something constructive on Libya, Morocco would say they can't participate. And Morocco would do something useful. Algeria would just pull out. And they were both actually doing useful things. And it struck me as very counterproductive for both countries. Morocco and Algeria and the whole region, internal trade is 4% of their total external trade. 4%, it's 4.6, I think. It's less than 5%. It's ridiculous. There's no other region in the world that has so little trade with its neighbors. It doesn't make any sense, yet seems still to be frozen in time. So I look at the actors and I say, well, who could do it? If the Algerians and Moroccans aren't going to do it bilaterally, who could be the convener? Is it the UN? Well, Morocco's been periodically furious with the UN over Western Sahara. Is it the French? Well, certainly not them. Is it the Americans? Not currently. Is it the Chinese? Well, the Chinese are mostly there to sell them stuff, and they're selling them a lot more stuff. Is it the Gulf states? Well, the Gulf states have been investing in Morocco, the one country that has really accepted a lot of foreign investment. The Algerians don't. Some of the Gulf state tensions were discussed in the last panel, and they're real, but they are potentially available. When I was working in the territory, it was interesting to me to find Emiratis, members of the Emirati royal family, vacationing in Morocco for extended periods of time. So there's a real tie there that is perhaps underappreciated and is an underpinning to a potential future. So what does that say about regional diplomacy? It asks the question, who's going to convene and who's going to make the first move? One more point, then I'm going to turn the mic back over. Late last year, Morocco said, let's start talking about ending the closed border, about opening up the border. And Algeria found various ways to say no. The big dynamic right now, of course, is the change in Algeria. Who knows what's going to happen next? There's a tremendous opportunity, I think, for regional dynamism if the next generation of Algerians decide to approach the Algerian-Morocco relationship differently. And Morocco has to get serious itself in deciding what it wants out of that relationship beyond a resolution of the Western Sahara issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan, and we'll pick up a lot of those ideas later on in the discussion. For now, let's turn it over to Emiliano for his opening statement.
Do I have to turn on the mic?
I think it's working.
It's working? Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. It's a privilege to be part of this panel. And the usual disclaimer, my permanent job is with the OSCE in Vienna. I'm not here to represent the views of the OSCE. I'm speaking really on a personal capacity. And I want to make just a few general points in this first round of intervention. First one is really about North Africa, and I really praise this initiative of the Middle East Institute. I think this is a region of the world that would deserve, in this town, much more attention than is currently the case. There are many reasons why North Africa is not attracting the same attention that the Middle East or other areas of the world are. But there are also, as the first panel clearly showed, many reasons to focus on this. This is a region that is changing, that is very dynamic. We have a very deformed view of the region as a very static place, but if you listen carefully to the panelists in the previous panel, the region has been changing quite a bit. Each country is on a different trajectory, but they're all transforming. I think this paradigm of the Arab Spring and the failed Arab Spring is largely misleading. I think the larger reality is that all these countries are, the regimes that took roots after the colonial era have all run their course in a way or another, and we're seeing different types of transition playing out in different ways. And it's a region that is growingly connected with the rest of Africa. You can't explain really the instability in Libya or the phenomenon of terrorism if you don't take a larger view of what is happening not only in the Sahel but beyond. And Africa is a growing continent, but a very unevenly growing continent. North Africa sits on top of that. The projections by the United Nations is that Africa will add over 1 billion people, 1,300,000,000 more people between now and 2050. That's in 30 years. And North Africa alone will be 120 million more. So in many ways, without presenting it as a sort of demographic time bomb, it's a region that will continue changing, probably in ways that we in Europe and the US don't like. But that's an additional reason to get engaged. And the final reason is that it's a region of the world in which there are many more players than there used to be. We spent the entire first panel talking about the local actors, but also about the Gulf. And the European Union came in only at the very end because of a question we got from the audience. But there is a larger role that the Gulf states are playing. I'm going to return to that in a second. And a larger role that Russia is aspiring to play, and a large role that China is playing already from an economic standpoint. I think is already the largest trade partner of Algeria, and is aspiring to increase its presence in Morocco, in Tunisia, and in a lot of other countries. So to the extent that North Africa is the sort of playing field for all these different influences and all these different actors, some of which are strategic allies of the US, some of which are competitors and rivals of the US. I think there is a case to be made also for the US, not just Europe, to remain focused on the region, even if the sort of instincts would be to stay aloof and to stay detached as much as possible. A few points about Europe. I think that Europe remains a very important player in the region, remains a very important market for the region, remains, an unavoidable factor in the region. But the whole construct about North Africa and the Mediterranean being the European Union neighborhood, that has been put to question already years ago. I think it was a very problematic characterization from the beginning because it gave this sense of a center of a periphery, but it could have had some significance when Europe was really proceeding fast towards integrating, and you could have looked at North Africa and other parts of the world around Europe, just benefiting from the influences of European integration and getting access to the European market, and maybe also reforming politically, economically, according to European Union preferences. But I think that scenario is no longer on the table. As I said, this is a region that is very fragmented with a lot of different influences, and Europe can only play a relatively small role after all, especially if it is divided as it is now. I can talk about French and Italian differences on Libya or in other files, and especially if European policy towards that region is increasingly driven not by the foreign ministries of the European countries, but the interior ministries of our countries, and everything is seen through the lens of radicalization and terrorism or migration. And that sort of undermines a more ambitious view of how to restart diplomacy at the regional level. There's no big vision coming from Europe or the EU about the region. It's all about trying to shield Europe from all these negative influences that are coming from the region. Final point about Libya, and then in the discussion I'm happy to take any question you might have. I think Libya is, of course, in all respects now a proxy conflict. Proxy conflict that also sees some European countries on somewhat different lines. But I think even here, Europe has been largely sidelined. So I've seen all this commentary about France and Italy and the different roles. I think what is very depressing to me is to see how little influence these two countries have on dynamics in Libya. And on the contrary, at least the way Italy looks at it right now, this is becoming more and more of, we are entering a sort of Middle Easternization of the Libyan conflict, with Gulf states playing a very important role. That's at least how the latest military offensive of General Haftar has been seen in Italy as something that was endorsed in the Gulf. And I think France and Italy are now actually pushed towards finding some common position, because I think they're both uncomfortable with the position they've been keeping so far. Italy clearly realizes that having invested so much only on the national government of national accord hasn't really paid off, was probably never realistic, and has been engaging Haftar for a while from the Palermo conference at least onwards. And France is also not so happy with how things have played out, not only because Haftar is now discredited internationally for having breached some of the commitments he had made to reconciliation and pacification, but also because the military operation hasn't really succeeded in the way he had hoped. And so, if you read statements coming from France and the French Foreign Ministry, I think there is a rethinking going on, and that could lead potentially also to a more unified European position and some European initiative. But of course, there are a lot of obstacles. There are European elections coming up. The government in Italy is, a populist government. Macron wants to portray himself as the anti-populist leader in Europe. So I don't really see, in the run-up to the European elections, major European initiatives. But I think Europeans have to get engaged. This military offensive also showed that there's no real military solution to the Libyan political crisis. The military solution can only go that far, so that should push towards a re-energization of diplomacy, including EU diplomacy. And I think there is a role to play for the US as well. It's understandable that the US is not so eager to get involved in North African issues, let alone in Libya, with all the legacy of the intervention and all that we know. But I think to the extent that the US has all this leverage on the Gulf states, it can still play a big role in at least de-escalating the conflict, calling on different Gulf states that are on different sides, Qatar, the Emirates, to apply some restraint in the weeks ahead when it comes to the Libya crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliano, and thanks for laying out the view from Europe as well. Now we'll turn to Alexis, who has the view from the United States.
This is going to be a bit of whiplash, I think. Thanks for the chance to be on this panel. It's been a very rich discussion so far, and it's not that often that we get to spend a whole afternoon thinking about North Africa, so I'm grateful to MEI for that. I'm going to focus on the congressional sort of angle here, so not U.S. policy writ large, but Congress's role and tools in shaping U.S. approaches to North Africa. And I'm going to specifically focus on Morocco and Tunisia since 2011, because both countries have long drawn sort of a fair amount of interest and engagement by members of Congress. Congress has shaped U.S. policy and engagement with those countries through a number of tools, notably legislation, particularly foreign aid appropriations and defense authorization measures, through its oversight activities, and through direct engagement between members of Congress and elites in these countries. For example, Senator Lindsey Graham, who chairs the subcommittee of appropriations that funds the State Department and U.S. foreign aid, was recently in Tunis and drew some attention, of course, for his remarks about Libya and Haftar at that moment. It's hard to speak of sort of a unified congressional view about anything. That's almost non-existent on any issue. But I think broadly there has been an interest within Congress in encouraging deep and broad U.S. relations with both Morocco and Tunisia. And members of Congress have seen themselves as sort of one of the pillars of U.S. engagement with these countries and of support for both countries, including an interest in bolstering, trade and economic relations, but also security cooperation, including on counterterrorism. So I'll say a bit more about the tools that I mentioned before, starting with foreign aid appropriations. So since 2011, Congress has appropriated funds for bilateral loan guarantees and for Tunisia, and a Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, which is intended to sort of boost Tunisia's economy by investing in small and medium-sized startups. And since 2016, Congress has actually set a floor in legislation for overall bilateral economic and military aid to Tunisia. Currently, that floor is set at $191 million in FY 2019. These kinds of provisions, along with similar but less specific provisions around aid to Morocco, have served effectively in recent years to protect Tunisia and Morocco from proposed aid cuts coming from the executive branch. Touching on defense authorization, Tunisia in particular has been a top recipient within Africa of the Defense Department's Global Train and Equip for Counterterrorism Authority, first authorized by Congress in 2006, and then regularly extended and now entered into statute. Morocco has comparatively received little of that type of assistance over time, partly because it has exhibited fewer pressing capacity gaps in counterterrorism in recent years, but it does receive substantial U.S. military equipment and training through other U.S. programs and through military sales, which are separately authorized and overseen by Congress. Congress has also authorized DoD to support Tunisia's military in securing its border with Libya, and we see a couple of programs in that domain. For example, in contrast, it has not granted similar authorization for Algeria. Other legislation has periodically been introduced and considered in Congress, particularly around support for Tunisia, but also Morocco. So the Combating Terrorism in Tunisia Emergency Support Act of 2017, which was introduced in the House in the last Congress, would have explicitly authorized certain types of security, economic, and democracy promotion aid for Tunisia. That bill did not advance into law, but it served as sort of a marker of congressional interest and intent. Also in the last Congress, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee considered a resolution timed to coincide with Prime Minister Shahid's visit to Washington, which commended Tunisia for its trajectory since 2011 and encouraged further progress on political and economic reforms. In terms of reactions from the region to this kind of engagement, I think there's been a pretty open door and a lot of interest in both capitals, in Tunis and Rabat, for welcoming congressional interest, encouraging these kinds of person-to-person relationships, and leveraging this interest in Congress as a means to ensure continued support for aid and military cooperation. I wanted to make a few words about Western Sahara as well, and sort of how this issue has played out on the Hill. Both Morocco and the Polisario have viewed Congress as an arena for advancing their views and their interests, often seeking to leverage congressional pressure to compel a change in position by the executive branch. Since 2014, the House has advanced appropriations measures that would mandate U.S. bilateral economic aid for Morocco to be spent in Western Sahara, which could be viewed as a means of using Congress's power of the purse under the Constitution to affect executive branch deliberations on diplomatic recognition. And I can say a bit more about how those provisions have ended up being enacted and what that has meant practically in the Q&A if anybody is particularly interested. Members in the House have also introduced legislation in the current and previous Congresses to affirm the importance of U.S.-Morocco relations and criticize, the Polisario and aspects of Polisario behavior. There have been few congressional public reactions to the current administration's efforts to exercise pressure on both sides of this issue in an effort to compel a UN-mediated political settlement. But there have been some personnel changes in key committees in this Congress compared to the last one, and it will be interesting to watch the FY 2020 appropriations process to look for clues as to how this might play out on the Hill in response. So with that, I'll cede it back.
Thanks so much. I'd like to turn to security quickly, maybe not so quickly. And Libya seems like a sensible place to start there. I was just reading an interview with the French foreign minister in which he was asked why France was so involved in Libya. He, of course, cited terrorism, and then he said the goal was to, quote, avoid contagion. And he said there was a risk of instability spreading to places like Tunisia and Egypt around the region. Jonathan, I want to start with you about sort of how linked the security picture is and whether that's a real risk.
Well, when Libya went through its period of civil war in 2014, in which there were forces aligned with Egypt and the Emirates and Saudi and Jordan in the east, fighting with forces in the west aligned with Turkey and Qatar, both getting support from their respective sides, was the period of time when the Islamic State found its way into Libya and established substantial territory. The United States wound up working with a number of other countries to create the government of national accord, which Russia, the Gulf states, Qatar, Turkey, as well as the other side, all signed on to. And successfully through an air campaign that worked very, very closely with Libyans on the ground from Tripolitania, not Khalifa Haftar's army, extirpated the territorial control of the Islamic State, which was very substantial, covered a wide swath of Libya's central coastal region around Sirte. There are Islamists affiliated with Haftar. There are Islamists opposed to Haftar. There are extremists affiliated with Haftar. There are extremists opposed to Haftar. People I've talked to, Libyans I've talked to over an extended period of time, basically all have the same message about Haftar. General Haftar wants to restore the Gaddafi period with him having the role that Gaddafi used to have and erasing Gaddafi from history and replacing Gaddafi with Haftar and his sons in a dynasty that involves a personal rule under a military dictatorship without any politicians of any kind. He told me this basically in 2016, that was his preference, that Libya's politicians were no good, and that there were three places the Islamists could go. They could go into exile, they could go into prison, or they could go into the graveyards. And I think we all would agree, he said, the graveyards would be best. That's what he said to me. I said, I don't think we would all agree on that. We were trying very hard to get him into a condominium where he would accept civilian rule. He would not accept that. So this is a power grab by a very ambitious guy who wants to correct decades of humiliation of not being at the center of Libyan life after he got abandoned by Gaddafi. Now, for the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Russians, who have been his biggest supporters over the last 3 years, He is a potential LCC of someone who could control Muslim Brotherhood, if that's your primary concern. What's been interesting is that the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Libya has actually been among the most pluralistic and compromising. Now, maybe this is because they have a tiny minority of support, and therefore they don't think they can get it any other way, but nevertheless, it's still the case. You cannot transplant Egypt to Libya. They're different countries. They're not the same. Haftar has always promised to take any city he's going to take within 2 to 3 weeks. He promised to take Benghazi in 2 to 3 weeks. It took him 3 years with an air campaign by other countries. It's left the city in ruins. He got rid of the extremists who were killing people there and taking away freedom, and replaced it with his own military governor. Did the same thing in Derna. It took him a couple of years. Tripoli is somewhat larger than twice as big as Benghazi in terms of its official population. Depending on how you think about it, it's even bigger than that. This could be a very long haul. It's not clear to me how much air support the Emiratis, Egyptians are going to give, how much money the Saudis are going to give, and how many more Russian state-printed dinars Russia is going to give. But I do not see Libya as being willing fundamentally to substitute Haftar for Gaddafi. The solutions become about sharing resources, sharing power, sharing it regionally, geographically, as well as with all the other divisions of society. It's not sectarian fundamentally. Finding ways to get the oil pumped and then reinvested in the country to build a common future. General Haftar will be about creating a patronage network that he controls, which is not quite the same thing at all. So it's a very, very dangerous time for all of these reasons. I used to ask myself every day when I was special envoy, would General Haftar be better than the really impossible policy the United States is promoting of trying to get the Libyans together? And every day I would say to myself, it's got to be easier than what we're doing. Haftar's should be, no, it just won't work. It wasn't a failure to consider the issue. We kept looking at it as a possibility. It just wouldn't work. So that's where we are. We think right now that it seems to me that countries have got their fingers up in the air. They're trying to decide how things are going to go on the ground. Libyans will define their future through what happens on the ground, unless there is a very large air campaign by foreigners. If there is such a thing, I fear, and hope that I would be wrong, a situation like Syria, where you had part of the country controlled by a military dictatorship, in essence, backed by a patronage network, and then a resistance building out which included Syria's terrorists. That in turn threatens Tunisia. That in turn threatens Algeria. That threatens further criminalization of the economy, further refugee flows, further problems for North Africa, and everything the French purport to care about. So I think the policy of encouraging military adventurism is a bad policy. I think it will fail to the risk of all of the Maghreb, and good things won't happen for Europe either. And that's how I look at it. Thank you.
I won't claim you tried to evade the question. I think you took it straight on there, so I appreciate that.
I tried not to talk about Libya in my opening.
No, I mean, it was fascinating. Emiliano, I'd imagine you might have some thoughts on Libya as well, and I'm happy to have you address those. I'd also like to ask you to expand upon what you said about Europe, priorities number 1 and 2 when it comes to this region seeming to be migration and extremism, and everything else kind of goes by the wayside. If you could expand on sort of missed opportunities and areas that aren't being addressed in that relationship.
Yeah, let me react to the question you asked to Jonathan just now about security and the security nexus, and I will try in the context of that to elaborate a little bit more on Italy and France. I think there are connections between groups operating in North Africa, and I think France sees these connections more than other European countries. And when you look at the policies of France and Italy in North Africa in general and in Libya in particular, France, because of also its domestic experience with terrorism, has focused much more on the terrorist threat than anything else, whereas Italy, because of, thankfully, its lack of experience with Islamic terrorism, has focused much more on other types of spillover effects, in particular irregular migration. And I know that there's also a very clear competition for influence in Libya, and that there's a lot of commentary about, Italian energy company and French energy company competing for the same resources. But I think there is also this sort of larger strategic framework that you have to adopt. Italy very much focused on irregular migration, which has affected Italy much more than any other country, at least when it comes to the central Mediterranean route, and France very much focused on the connection between North Africa and the Sahel. And it's very unfortunate that these two countries haven't found ways to cooperate in a sort of complementary way, because these two aspects, migration and terrorism, are part of the same equation, not because migrants are terrorists, that's a stupid thing to think, but because, of course, all of this ultimately has its origin in the instability and in the underdevelopment, not only of the Sahel region, but of sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. So you could easily imagine a strategy by which, with a division of role, France accepts, to do some burden sharing when it comes to migration and migration policy in Europe, similar to what Germany did when it came to the Eastern Mediterranean and Syria, and Italy plays a bigger role in the Sahel, which is currently not really playing. And you have to remember that in 2012, when Mali asked for assistance and France stepped in, and Italy was very reluctant to take a role. I think we have some presence in Niger, but we're not really a big player in the Sahel right now. So I think there are these two aspects, migration and terrorism, are distinct, but at the same time are part of a larger picture. And France and Italy could cooperate much more. I think there's also potential for involving, around the Libyan crisis, Maghreb countries, which have supported. I mean, we discussed about all their political differences and all their foreign policy differences. But after all, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, which are differently affected by the Libyan crisis. Morocco is, of course, much less directly affected. They supported the UN-mediated efforts until now. They had an important role to play in the run-up to the Skirat Agreement of 2015. And so, of course, it's a little bit unfortunate that now Algeria is in this very difficult situation, even if it's a promising situation politically, maybe, because there's no clear leadership, and I don't think they are in the position right now to play any role in regional diplomacy. But there could be a potential for greater coordination between the Maghreb countries and the southern Mediterranean countries, provided that France and Italy find some common ground on Libya and other files, etc. Egypt is a different story. Egypt is directly affected and is very much on one side, even though Egypt also expressed sort of uneasiness with latest developments, but of course is much more involved on one side of the Libyan crisis. And countries like Italy are in a very difficult spot because they tend to have good relations and also very lucrative relationships with all these different states in the Middle East and in the Gulf. So we have a very important relationship with Egypt, also because of energy developments off the coast of Egypt. We have some issue with Egypt when it comes to the Regeni case, the assassination of an Italian student. This is a story that never really attracted a lot of media attention in the US, but we have a big problem with that, with the assassination of an Italian student, and it's still not clear who did it, and nobody really went to, paid for it. But we have this important relationship with Egypt, but we also have an important relationship with Qatar. We also have an important relationship with the Emirates and growing business and trade with the Gulf in general. So we are a little bit in a difficult spot, but I think looking at the picture, there is potential for this sort of greater coordination and rapprochement between the Maghreb countries on one side and the southern Mediterranean countries on the other side.
Great. And Alexis, turning back to the U.S. now, Jonathan pointed out that the U.S. is not playing sort of the key role in terms of facilitating cooperation between countries, kind of unlocking some of the opportunities there. Is there even such thing, in your view, as a U.S. policy on North Africa? Is there a regional policy there, or is it something pops up and we react? I mean, can you identify any kind of long-running policy there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a bit odd for there to be just an overarching U.S. North Africa policy and not a U.S. Tunisia policy, a U.S. Morocco policy, a U.S. Algeria policy, and a U.S. Libya policy. I think both from a U.S. perspective and from the perspective of these countries in the region, that would be that would cause friction, right? And probably wouldn't serve U.S. or regional interests very well. On the other hand, there are a couple of common threads, across the decades of U.S. interests in fostering greater, for example, trade integration, economic integration. There were some big pushes on that, especially in the 90s, and then even a little bit periodically since then. There has been certainly an interest on the security side in encouraging the countries of the region to cooperate more amongst themselves to counter transnational threats, to work with the U.S. and other like-minded external players in a productive way. There have been periodic efforts to sort of hive off the Western Sahara issue for the purpose of convincing Morocco and Algeria to work together, in other domains of their relationship, sometimes backed by, those two governments, at least rhetorically, and sometimes less so. But I think at the end of the day, what Jonathan led off on by saying that, there are fundamentally barriers within the region to these countries wanting to work together. At the end of the day, that's going to supersede any U.S. grand plans about forcing their hands. That isn't to say that the U.S. can't play around the margins, can't exercise some influence in setting incentives, but that influence is going to be more or less limited.
Yeah, I would argue slightly differently than that, which is that if the United States were to, in a consistent, systematic fashion, push opportunities for economic integration, for economic cooperation, reduced trade barriers, security cooperation on discrete areas like border security and countering terrorism, dealing with illegal migration, or even on areas like promoting tech engagement in the region, that there are real opportunities. I think Algeria has been waiting for change. I think it has been not quite ready at the top to go there, but that the society is waiting for it. It's so far behind in basic things like internet access of other countries in North Africa, including Tunisia and Libya, that its population is so substantial and its per capita income is the highest, I think it's just below Libya, but it's higher than Morocco, that I would think that with a different government, one that's simply ready for some change, that all kinds of opportunities could be unlocked. Nobody thinks the United States has territorial ambitions in North Africa. Russia may have some ambitions of some kind. China has certain kinds of ambitions. I don't think people really believe the United States does. For that reason, a generous, constructive United States presence could potentially unlock things in a way that reduced jealousies and anxieties, in a way that France cannot and that Italy cannot. And the EU is particularly poorly positioned right now to do very much anywhere, unfortunately. The EU might be able to under other circumstances. Now, if the United States doesn't do it, the other players, as I mentioned, Russia, China for getting to buy things, the other players are the Gulf states. And the Gulf states have some best practices to bring to bear on the economic side in terms of the city-state capabilities, then becoming national and regional capabilities. And Dubai and Abu Dhabi both are going great guns in this territory in all kinds of digital areas, for example. So I think that there are things that the Gulf states may be able to do in the domestic economy seriatim, one by one. But I don't think that they're thinking about it in a regional way. And of course, they're so much further along in Morocco than they are elsewhere, and have made very little penetration of Algeria. So I keep asking myself, what is the modality? What's the mechanism by which people outside the Maghreb could get people inside the Maghreb to be talking to one another to promote cooperation? What's the modality? It's not probably the IMF. It's probably not the World Bank. So who is it? Morocco's had its problems with the UN. So who is it? And that's why I think the United States, because for the most part we've been perceived as largely not obnoxious in recent years. That's largely not obnoxious. There's always legitimate complaints. And therefore there might be an opportunity in an administration that was interested in going that direction.
I'm going to turn it over shortly to audience questions, but a quick follow-up, Jonathan, since you mentioned China's role in buying stuff. I was looking at the trade numbers earlier, and the countries that really are the big players in terms of trade, we've talked about France, Italy, Spain is in the picture, and China is really the other major trading partner, is increasingly so. Is that something that, obviously there's a lot of concern in this administration and in Washington in general right now about China growing these economic relationships around the world. Is that something that you think is of concern in this part of the world?
Somebody's got to sell them stuff. They don't make it, for the most part, internally. And China undersells everybody, and China's been told to go global. So it's whether one likes it, doesn't like it, it's a reality. If Libya ever gets its act together, there's going to be a massive amounts of Chinese construction again, because Chinese and Egyptian construction were the two major things going at the time things broke down. And so that's a fact. In the time that I was doing the diplomacy over Libya, the Chinese were always constructive in a low-key fashion. That is, they weren't trying to take the initiative on anything in the political realm. If there wasn't going to be stress to them by cooperating with us, that is, if Russia wasn't going to get on the other side in their face, they were happy to be helpful. So they were almost entirely focused on selling stuff, not any broader agenda, and being there with other things to happen later. And so the question then becomes, is not what the Chinese are doing and what should be done about it, but what are we doing and what should we be doing? And then the Chinese will be another problem for another day. Having a coherent U.S. policy for Libya and for each of these North African countries would be a good thing to have. I'm not sure that I've seen one over the last couple of years for the most part. I may have been missing something.
I have a few more questions here, but I want to make sure we get plenty of time for audience questions, so let's start right here in front. I think there are microphones coming around, so please just identify yourself when the mic comes, and we'll take two questions now, and then we'll rotate through.
Jim Hollifield, director of the Tower Center at SMU. Nobody said anything about the diaspora, the pretty large populations in France and Italy and elsewhere in Europe. So the question is, is the diaspora playing any positive role here in terms of investments, return migration? I also want a question for Jonathan, others. Could you tell us about the U.S. trading relationship with these countries? We have a trade agreement with Morocco, I believe, right? If you could say just a bit more about what kind of agreements we have. And I would love it if Alessandra could tell us more about why are the French and the Italians fighting so much right now?
All interesting questions. We'll take one more, and then we'll, right here, right? Sure.
Thank you. My name is Ken Audrey. I'm a former Foreign Service officer, and I have a question for Jonathan here. I agree with you that resolving the I think it's good that you spoke that resolving the Morocco-Algeria problem should be a priority, because when I started my career in Morocco, I could see that the closure of the border was hampering economic development because things just couldn't go back. In fact, day-to-day exchanges or travel. About that time, it was the good old days when the Polisario was flexing its muscles. And then later on, 20 years later, I was analyst for North African affairs in the State Department and in INR, and it was still going on at logjam. Do you have any suggestions for how Morocco and the Polisario can solve things together? Is there any solution?
All right, so we've got...
It's our third panel.
Yes. Actually, Jonathan, do you want to? There's two questions directly to you. I think it's that most recent one,
I'll
and
do
then the
short.
trading relationships with countries.
Yeah, we have a free trade agreement with Morocco. Morocco makes a variety of things, and there's good bilateral commerce. Libya sells oil. Algeria sells oil mostly not to the United States. There's not much else for Algeria to sell. It's 90% of its exports are oil right now. That's Algeria's problem. 90%, 98% of Libya's hard currency exports are oil. So there's not a lot else there. Tunisia, of course, has massive unemployment, and it does sell cooking oil and other foodstuffs for the most part. There's still opportunities to do more, I think, with Tunisia. On Western Sahara, Morocco should declare victory, provide some revenue stream for the maintenance of an increasingly geriatric Polisario, so that there's a guaranteed revenue stream and Algeria doesn't have to subsidize them anymore from phosphates or oil and gas, something that allows them to maintain their population to the east of the berm. And Morocco should go about its business and work out other things with Algeria without having to crow about the fact that it's won victory. So a smart, generous policy by a victorious Morocco might actually solve that problem, consistent with the king's goal of demonstrating that he has preserved the patrimony he was inherited for his country. And that's how I would go about it. I would try and give Algeria enough of a sop with that kind of a shared revenue stream going forward that both relieves Algeria of the burden and doesn't have it abandoning the people that it protected. Now, it's easy to say all of that. You couldn't say all of that in a negotiation, any of that probably in a negotiation that directly. And if you did, they would probably never talk to you again. But something like that might actually work. You'd have to keep the UN out of it. And keep it all very secret, and maybe never even announce it, but do it. So I don't know, but that would be great. And of course, reopening that border would really make a difference to both countries. There was an IMF study a year or two ago, which said that the economies of all of the Maghreb countries would go up 5% if they could bring down the barriers. Immediately, it would add to growth 5%, and I believe that.
Okay, and Emiliano, a fun one for you. Why are the French and the Italians fighting so much?
Well, it's never been a particularly easy relationship. I think you have to differentiate between the Libya file and the sort of larger the tensions that you see currently at play. On Libya, I think differences, as I said during my intervention, date back to the time of the NATO intervention, which Italy only very reluctantly accepted to join. And they have continued throughout different governments, also the center-left governments sort of bought into this narrative or even propounded this narrative that there was always some sort of French agenda in Libya and sort of, a sort of conspiracy-minded view of what France was trying to achieve. And of course, there are post-colonial legacies in Italy playing a role. The average Italian doesn't really look at Libya as a sort of domain reservé of the Italians, but of course there are a lot of interests there, and we think we know the country much better than many others. So on the Libya file, I mean, that's not new. I think what is new is this, animosity and antagonism on all kinds of issues, including about future of Europe, future of European integration, because of the politics in the two countries. And with our current government, it's called yellow-green government, but it's a populist government, sovereignty-oriented. We call them sovereigntist. And the two parties that are in the coalition government look at France as the example of all that is wrong with the European and international elites that they want to fight, and it's a very populist stance. And at the same time, Macron has identified in Matteo Salvini, the current deputy prime minister and interior minister, who is the one now managing migration or just blocking, trying to block migration, as the sort of antithetical figure, the sort of antichrist, and so there is this dynamic at play, and it will be very interesting to see, because Macron doesn't seem to enjoy a lot of support in France these days, and Salvini is trying to build a coalition with the Front National in France, and maybe build a coalition even after the European election. So this could continue, and depending on the changing balance of power in Europe, we may have more or less of this tension. But if I may go back to the point about the US, and I'm not as optimistic as you that the US can now play a role in North Africa. It's not completely, how to put it, there's a legacy, there's some baggage there. It's not a uniformly positive experience in recent years. But I think, to go back to my earlier points, I think the U.S. can play this sort of moderating role and use its leverage with the Gulf states, as well as with some of the North African states, all of which have ties with the U.S., from Egypt to Morocco. We commented on that already. So I think the U.S. can at least play this role in trying to de-escalate tension and also push Europeans to take a larger responsibility. I also think if there was any need among an audience of experts to say this, that the Libya escalation, the Libya crisis shows that the axis of conflict in the MENA region is not only the one around Iran, as the current US administration would want us to believe. There is still very much the Palestinian issue to be solved. Recent developments, testify to that, and that's still a very important conflict, maybe not the framing conflict in the region. There is, of course, the conflict around Iran and Iranian influence in the region, but there's also an intra-Sunni proxy playing out in Libya. So there are at least these three broad axes of conflict, and it's very unfortunate that the US is sort of, not even prioritizing one, but trying to convince everyone else that the only real enemy and the only real problem is Iran, which we may discuss in another panel. And the point about China, I think, is also very important. We shouldn't overestimate the role of all these extra regional actors, but it's a fact that China is part of the economic equation of the region, and it may soon become also part of the political and security equation. And it has a policy that is very clear about trying to acquire ports, acquire assets in the region. And if the Trump administration is serious about competing with China, there should be also a North African piece to that, which isn't necessarily only containment, but is about proposing other things and trying to increase US and Western investment in the region, and so on and so forth. The same applies to Russia, which is trying to play, is aspiring to play a mediating role, I think, in the Libyan crisis, at the same time supporting one side probably more than the other. And I think the worst scenario that we should, try to avoid, rule out from happening, is a Syria scenario in which both the U.S. and the Europeans are largely sidelined. You have Gulf states and others fomenting a proxy war with the West largely unable or unwilling to be part of the solution. So imagine a North Africa that is left to its own with all this difficult transition. We talked about Tunisia, doesn't look as stable as we thought. Algeria, Morocco, as we commented in the previous panel, has its own internal challenges. I think this is the time for Europe and the United States, with all the constraints and domestic constraints and resource constraints, to still remain engaged and develop a common view of the region, together with those countries that are interested in this type of initiative.
Great. And Alexis, I think you had some thoughts on the Europe question as well.
Oh, actually, I wanted to make sure someone commented on the diaspora question. So I don't have a lot to say on that. And obviously, the diaspora in Europe is a very different, setting and importance and prominence in particularly France, Italy, Spain, than in the U.S. I was just going to observe that, I work on some countries outside of North Africa where diaspora populations here in the United States play a huge role in shaping congressional engagement, or at least in prompting congressional engagement. And as far as I can tell, that's not really so much the case with the North African countries. So there's probably opportunity there, for... So the Moroccan government's very active, yes. In terms of Congress's engagement with Morocco being driven by considerations about diaspora constituents, I would say it's less than some countries, not to say it's zero. On the trade relationship, obviously we've already touched on the Morocco free trade agreement. Obviously Congress enacted that into law, so there's a clear congressional prerogative there as well. There has been periodic discussion within Congress about an FTA for Tunisia since 2011. I would say that that's been subsumed in larger congressional debates about trade policy, and now in larger intra-US government debates about trade policy. But with the Trump administration's stated interest in encouraging more bilateral FTAs and less of sort of a regional approach to trade policy, it's conceivable that that could come back on the agenda either on the Hill or for the executive branch.
If I can say just one thing about diasporas, I think it's interesting in Italy that we don't really have a lot of views coming from Arab minorities in Italy about Italian foreign policy or migration. That's for a number of reasons. Of course, in France you have a different situation. We have second, third generation immigrants, Arab origin citizens. In Italy, many of our Arab minorities in Italy are not citizens of Italy. They haven't acquired citizenship yet. They may not acquire citizenship according to our rules. Some of the more recent waves of migration, these people stay in Italy for the short to medium term, and then they tend to also migrate somewhere else to wealthier countries, in the center and north of Europe. And when it comes to Libya, it's surprising to me, given the history of colonization and all of that, that we don't really, either way, I think, as Italians and as, Italians of Libyan origins, there is not a lot of probably memory and not a lot of emotion involved. I think a lot of Italians don't even remember that we colonized Libya, to be honest. So it's a very different situation, I think, from France and the role that France played in Africa and the legacies that are still very much there. It's not fully comparable.
All right, so we are really up against the clock, but I'm going to try and take two more questions, and then we'll wrap up here. So did you have a question? Yeah.
I have a question for Ambassador Weiner.
Sure.
Oh,
wait a second.
She'll go. We'll get both. He has the mic already. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question for Ambassador Weiner on something that hasn't been touched upon that could be a major factor, particularly in Libya, and that is the 600 to 800 estimated $1 billion of Gaddafi hidden assets worldwide, which there are indications could be an influence on the current administration. But my question to you, Jonathan, is, do you think that, first of all, I appreciate your frank and honest and accurate, I think, assessment of the General Haftar, but it's looking more and more like he's making significant military progress and might actually become a unifying force. Do you see in that eventuality, that possibility, that the 600 to 800 billion of assets could be recovered and could be a major force for maintaining peace and unity and for economic development, of course, for the whole region?
And last question right here in the front.
Thanks. I had a bit of a comment on your proposed solution to the Western Sahara. If I could just kind of push you a little bit on that. I think what you were talking about in terms of Morocco declaring victory was probably an accurate way of looking at it up until after 2008, when Morocco was able to put sort of the discussion around the referendum aside and really was very secure in the support for its de facto control from various actors, the EU, the US, and the UN even. But that has not really been the case recently. Morocco has faced legal challenges in European courts. It's facing pressure from the administration here to come to some sort of solution on the Western Sahara, and not the kind of solution that I think you are referring to. So All of these things kind of combined, how do they fit into what you were suggesting?
I apologize. I know there were lots of hands, but that'll have to be the end. We've already run over time. So, Jonathan, if you want to address that. And then I think we might have a quick question for everybody to answer, which was, are we getting Gaddafi's money back? We can maybe run down and do closing remarks. But, Jonathan, if you want to start with the Western Sahara
Sure.
question.
On Western Sahara, if you offer the other side nothing, and Morocco has offered the other side nothing, fundamentally, you're going to wind up with a lot of pushback. By declaring victory, I mean taking what they in fact have de facto and finding ways to accommodate others that are not too painful, and thus buying themselves a solution. That's precisely, you just provided all the reasons why they need to do the kind of approach that I was suggesting. If they could, it may be politically impossible or unwise for them to do so internally. We could have a long discussion on it. It'd be fascinating for me. I'm not a big believer in hidden money. I once was on the trail of Sukarno's money that was hidden in Zurich, in a basement in Zurich, underneath a bunch of the banks on behalf of a client. I got to read up on a whole history of scams. Until Gaddafi's money appears, I'm going to remain quite skeptical about it. And no, I don't see hidden billions as being a unifying factor. I see it as being something quite different.
All right. Unless either of you have any thoughts on that, then that will be all from us. I want to thank our panelists and Middle East Institute and all of you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to our panelists again for an excellent conversation, excellent presentation. We're going to take a break now for coffee. If everyone could